Imagine a night when the fate of the richest country in the world hung by a thread. It is the night of November 3rd, 1907. The setting, New York, 209 Madison Avenue, a private library that looks more like a Renaissance cathedral. Walls lined with red Italian silk, the ceiling covered in frescoes, the air thick with the smell of expensive tobacco, old paper, and genuine human fear. Locked inside this room are 50 of America's most influential bankers, men whose combined fortunes exceed the budgets of European empires. But right now, they look like terrified schoolboys. They are sweating, exhausted. Some are crying, some are praying. They want to leave, but the massive bronze doors of the library are locked from the outside. The key lies in the vest pocket of one man. This man sits in the adjacent room, the West Room, calmly playing solitaire. He is 70 years old. He breathes heavily due to a cold. A massive Havana cigar smokes in his hand. His name is John Pierpont Morgan. He is not the U.S. president. He is not an army general. He holds no public office. But on this night, President Theodore Roosevelt sits in Washington powerless, waiting for a telegram from Morgan. The United States government has no central bank. The government has no money to stop a financial collapse. The entire hope of the nation, the entire future of capitalism depends on whether this old man with the key in his pocket can break the will of the bankers and force them to give up their money to save the country. Who is this man who took the financial elite hostage? Why was his power so absolute that even the Titanic belonged to him, and he miraculously missed boarding it? And most importantly, why, after his death, when his will was opened, was the world shocked by how little money he actually had? To understand how one man became the architect of America, we must go back to the beginning, to where a character was forged that was harder than the steel he would later monopolize. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut. If you think the childhood of a future billionaire is a sweet life, you're mistaken. His childhood was a series of sufferings. Little Pierpont was a walking medical encyclopedia. Seizures that made his body arch, chronic skin rashes that kept him awake, pneumonia, rheumatism, which sometimes made him unable to walk. He spent most of his childhood by the window, watching other children run outside. This isolation developed two traits in him that would become fatal for his competitors: phenomenal observation. He learned to read the world without participating in it, a love for order. In the chaos of his own sick body, he sought salvation in the clarity of numbers. He began keeping ledgers for imaginary companies before he could even write properly. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a giant, a stern, cold banker who moved to London and became a partner at Peabody and Costello. Junius was not just a father. He was an Old Testament God to Pierpont. He controlled his son's every step, every cent spent, every acquaintance. Junius wrote letters to his son that resembled military instructions. Remember, Pierpont, your main asset is reputation. Money can be recovered. Reputation, never. Do not befriend people who are not worthy of trust. Do not make risky bets. And remember the main rule of our house: never sell America short. This phrase, "don't sell America short," would become J.P. Morgan's mantra. Even when the whole country was burning in the fire of crisis, he would buy, believing in the greatness of the nation. When Pierpont's health improved, his father sent him to Europe, first to Switzerland, then to the University of Göttingen in Germany. It was here that an event occurred that could have changed history. Pierpont discovered a supernatural talent for mathematics. It wasn't just an ability to count. He felt the numbers. During lecture, a professor gave a problem thought to be impossible to solve quickly. Morgan raised his hand and gave the answer. He had calculated a complex root in his head. The professor was delighted. He offered Morgan a place at the department, promising him a career as a great scientist. "Stay, Herr Morgan," the professor said. "You can unlock the secrets of the universe." Morgan shook his head. "Mathematics is beautiful, Professor, but it is just a tool. I want to use this tool to build empires, not to describe them." He returned to New York in 1857. He was 20 years old. He was tall, had a piercing gaze, and a mind as sharp as a razor. And he walked into a perfect storm. In 1861, the U.S. Civil War began. The nation was split in half. Lincoln called for volunteers. Patriotic fervor swept the youth. What did Morgan do? He acted coldly and rationally, taking advantage of the draft law. He paid $300 for a substitute, a poor immigrant who went to fight and likely die in his place. Morgan did not see himself as a soldier. He saw himself as a financier. The story that best illustrates young Morgan is known as the Hall Carbine Affair. It was classic arbitrage. The U.S. Army wrote off thousands of obsolete rifles deemed dangerous. Morgan financed their purchase at scrap metal prices, $3.50 apiece. After slightly modernizing them, rifling the barrels, his partners sold these same rifles to General Fremont, who desperately needed weapons, for $22 apiece. Morgan made crazy money on the war. A congressional commission later called it fraud, but legally he was clean. He simply saw a market inefficiency and exploited it. The battle for gold. But he made his real capital not on weapons, but on information. During the Civil War, U.S. currency, greenbacks, was not 100% backed by gold. The dollar rate depended on news from the front. The North wins a battle, confidence grows. The dollar strengthens, gold falls. The North loses, panic, the dollar falls. Gold skyrockets in price. Morgan turned his office into an intelligence center. He installed a direct telegraph line, a novelty at the time. He knew the results of battles before the newspapers and even before some government officials. He played the gold fluctuations with the precision of a surgeon. He didn't just speculate. He managed volatility. By the end of the war, he was no longer just Junius's son. He was an independent player with a vast fortune. In the second half of the 19th century, America was experiencing an industrial boom, but it was a Wild West boom. The main problem was the railroads. Thousands of kilometers of tracks were being built. Fly-by-night companies laid tracks parallel to each other to blackmail competitors. Then, rate wars began. Tickets were sold below cost to destroy the neighbor. As a result, everyone went bankrupt. Trains derailed, bridges collapsed. Investors lost millions. Morgan looked at this with physical disgust. His brain, raised on German mathematics, could not tolerate inefficiency. He formulated a principle: competition is a sin, consolidation is salvation. Thus, Morganization was born. It was a brutal process. Morgan found a bankrupt railroad. He bought out its debts and became the master. He cut the fat, fired thieving directors, closed unprofitable branches. He forced warring railroads to merge into a single trust under his control, the Corsair Agreement. The most famous episode of Morganization occurred in 1885. The railroad tycoons of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad were waging a war of annihilation. They were building pointless parallel lines, losing millions. Morgan invited them to his luxurious black yacht, the Corsair. When the tycoons boarded, they expected a pleasant cruise up the Hudson, champagne and cigars. But Morgan ordered the captain to sail out into the open sea and not return. "Gentlemen," Morgan said when the shore disappeared from view, "until we reach an agreement, no one sets foot on land." He didn't shout. He just sat and looked at them with his terrifying eyes. The tycoons began to suffer from seasickness. They begged to go back. Morgan was unyielding. Hours later, green with nausea and broken psychologically, they signed the peace treaty Morgan dictated. He divided the market, set fixed prices, and stopped the war. Thus, he became the uncrowned king of American roads. By net, he controlled 50% of all U.S. railroads. Morgan always looked to the future. When Thomas Edison came to him with the idea of the electric light bulb, the entire financial world laughed. Gas companies were powerful lobbyists. Rockefeller, who sold kerosene for lamps, hated electricity. But Morgan wrote the check. He turned his own mansion at 210 Madison Avenue into a laboratory. It was the first private home in the world lit by electricity. At the opening party, guests in diamonds and tailcoats watched in horror as the bulbs flashed. A huge generator rumbled in the basement, shaking the walls. Neighbors complained about the noise and smoke. Once a short circuit occurred and Morgan's library caught fire. "This is the price of progress," Morgan said calmly, putting out the fire, and wrote a check for repairs. However, the story of the creation of General Electric shows Morgan's true nature. Edison was a brilliant inventor, but a poor strategist. He stubbornly clung to direct current, DC, losing the war to Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse's alternating current, AC. Edison's company was losing the market. Morgan could not let emotions interfere with profit. In 1892, he executed a ruthless operation. Behind Edison's back, he organized a merger of his company, Edison General Electric, with a competitor, Thomson Houston. When Edison found out, he was shocked. But the biggest blow was that Morgan crossed the inventor's name out of the title. The company became simply General Electric. Morgan effectively fired his friend to save the business. For him, efficiency was higher than loyalty. This was the moment Morgan moved from the League of Businessmen to the League of Demigods. Hating the gold panic, investors, frightened by economic instability, were mass exchanging dollars for gold and shipping it to Europe. The U.S. Treasury's gold reserve was melting before their eyes. It reached a critical point. The government had less than $9 million in gold left. This meant that in a day or two, the U.S. would declare default. The dollar would turn into paper. The world would turn away from America. President Grover Cleveland was a Democrat and a populist. He hated Wall Street. He refused to ask bankers for help. Morgan got on a train and went to Washington. When he arrived at the White House, Cleveland refused to see him. "I'll wait," said Morgan. He sat in the waiting room, lit a cigar, and began to wait. Hour after hour. Clerks ran back and forth, reporting to the president on the remaining gold. The situation was becoming catastrophic. Eventually, Cleveland surrendered. Morgan was invited into the office. The scene was tense. The president was nervous. Morgan was a block of ice. "Mr. President," said Morgan, "I know that by 3 o'clock this afternoon you will be bankrupt. But I know a law from the Civil War era that you have forgotten. The Act of 1802 allows you to buy kin from private individuals without Congress's permission." Morgan proposed a plan. He and the European House of Rothschild would immediately buy $65 million worth of U.S. bonds, paying in gold. "But the main thing is not the gold," added Morgan. "The main thing is my name. I give my word that I will stop the outflow of gold to Europe." "How can you guarantee that?" asked Cleveland. "I will just do it," replied Morgan. The deal was signed. As soon as the news that J.P. Morgan stood behind the dollar reached the markets, the panic stopped instantly. The word of one man proved weightier than the guarantees of the government. At the turn of the century, Morgan set his sights on steel. He understood the 20th century would be the century of skyscrapers, cars, and bridges, and that meant the century of steel. But standing in his way was Andrew Carnegie, the Steel King who controlled production. Carnegie was the complete opposite of Morgan, a weaver's son who started from the bottom He was a tough competitor. To create a monopoly, Morgan needed to buy out Carnegie's business. Carnegie's right-hand man, Charles Schwab, organized a dinner to sell the idea to Morgan. After Schwab's brilliant speech about the future of a supercorporation, Morgan, puffing on his cigar, said, "All right, go to Andrew, ask the price." The next day, Schwab met Carnegie on the golf course. Carnegie listened to the offer, took a pencil, and on a scrap of paper, wrote one figure. In today's money, this is hundreds of billions of dollars. It was more than the total value of all real estate in New York at that time. Schwab brought the paper to Morgan. Morgan looked at the figure without even blinking and said, "I accept." Thus, U.S. Steel was born, the first corporation in human history with a capitalization of over 1 billion buys. It controlled 60% of the market. Later, meeting on the deck of an ocean liner, Carnegie jokingly said, "You know, Pierpont, I think I sold too cheap. I should have asked for another 100 million. Morgan replied in a tone that wiped the smile off Carnegie's face. "If you had asked, Andrew, you would have gotten it." We returned to the scene in the library where we started October 2007. The bankers panic. The stock market fell by 50%. People were storming banks. Trust was gone. Morgan was sick, old, and wanted peace. But he understood if he didn't intervene, the America he had been building for 40 years would collapse. He acted like a military dictator. First, he saved a trust company, then the New York Stock Exchange. At the height of trading, the president of the exchange ran to Morgan. "We are closing. There is no money." "What time is it?" asked Morgan. 1:30 p.m. "You will not close before 3 p.m., ordered Morgan. He summoned the heads of the banks and in 10 minutes forced them to chip in $25 million. The money was delivered to the exchange a minute before the crash. Brokers cried and hailed the couriers as liberators, but the crisis did not recede. The fate of the brokerage firm Moore and Schley needed to be decided. Its collapse would drag everyone down. This is why Morgan locked the bankers in the library. He realized democracy doesn't work here. Tyranny is needed. All night, he sat in the next room playing solitaire while hysteria raged behind the doors. He waited for the moment of total psychological exhaustion of his prisoners. At 4:45 a.m., he walked in. He placed an agreement before them that required them to risk their own money. Edward King, the head of one of the trusts, tried to object. Morgan placed his heavy hand on his shoulder and looked him in the eye. "Here is the pen," Morgan uttered. King signed. Everyone signed. Morgan unlocked the doors, released them into the cold morning, and went to sleep. The next day, newspaper headlines screamed, "Morgan saved the nation." But along with gratitude came fear. People realized one man has the power to decide whether the economy lives or dies. That was too much. At the end of his life, the U.S. government decided to destroy Morgan's power. He was summoned to hearings in Congress, the Pujo Committee, in an attempt to prove the existence of a money trust, a secret conspiracy of bankers. At these hearings, the 75-year-old Morgan gave his last fight. It was a battle of two worldviews, the old world of honor and the new world of bureaucracy. The famous dialogue with prosecutor Samuel Untermeyer went down in history. Untermeyer is not commercial credit based primarily upon money or property? Morgan: no, sir. The first thing is character. Untermeyer: before money or property? Morgan: before money or anything else. Money cannot buy it, because a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom. He sincerely believed this. For him, business was a matter for gentlemen, not lawyers. Morgan was supposed to sail on his final visit to Europe on his own ship, the Titanic. He had the best suite booked, but at the last moment, he stayed in France due to his love for resorts and changed his mind. The Titanic sank without him. This only added mystique to his image, as if death itself feared taking him prematurely. He died a year later, on March 31st, 1913, at the Grand Hotel in Rome. His last words were delirious. He was still negotiating with someone invisible. On the day of his funeral, the New York Stock Exchange closed for 2 hours, an honor previously reserved only for presidents. And so, we return to the 3 questions of our introduction. When Morgan's will was announced, it turned out that his fortune, excluding the art collection he donated to museums, was about $80 million. For comparison, Rockefeller's fortune at that time was estimated at $900 million. John D. Rockefeller, reading this in the newspaper, took off his glasses and said, "To think, he wasn't even a rich man." Why was poor Morgan more powerful than rich Rockefeller? The answer is simple and terrifying. Morgan was the interface. Rockefeller owned oil. Carnegie owned steel. Harriman owned railroads. But Morgan owned trust. He was the point where all lines converged. European investors gave money to America only because Morgan was there. Bankers obeyed him not because he could buy them, but because he could excommunicate them from the system. His terrible gaze and huge red nose made him lonely. He was ashamed of his face, hated mirrors and photographers. This complex turned into armor. He learned to look at people so they saw not his nose, but his power. J.P. Morgan didn't just build railroads or factories. He built the very structure of the American economy. His death marked the end of the era of Atlas men. Just 8 months after his funeral, the U.S. created the Federal Reserve System. The government learned the lesson. The fate of the nation cannot depend on whether one man wakes up in a good mood. To replace one Morgan, an entire state institution was required. He was the last king of capitalism, ruthless, brilliant, and indispensable. And perhaps He was the one who truly invented America.